Together can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and in this series we examine issues which are of interest to the general Guyanese public. And today we'll be looking at the question of gang violence. And I asked myself the question, maybe some of you asked yourself the question too, whether the troubles that we experienced in the first decade of this century triggered gang violence, or did gang violence trigger the troubles? And perhaps, you can come to the conclusion that they were both interdependent. We know that there were troubles, a lot of people got killed, and we know that there was violence. But we have to ask ourselves, who introduced this term about drug gang warfare? And you remember that it was the PPP administration which was in office in 2002. And one of the top spokesmen of the PPP administration said, what we're seeing here is drug gang warfare. Many people have attributed the violence to ethnic rivalries, to political competition, to social causes. Some thought about liberation and all that. But the PPP itself deemed the violence as the result of drug gang warfare. And for the first time, Guyanese heard the expression about phantom gangs. Some of us growing up looking at old-time comic strips used to read about the phantom. But what did he mean by phantom gangs? So these two expressions came into our vocabulary early in the present century from the mouths of the PPP. That is, we're talking about drug gang warfare, not ethnic warfare, not race riots, drug gang warfare. And we're talking about phantom gangs. That is how this millennium started for many Guyanese. And what we've seen, my friends, is that gang violence has now become embedded, endemic in Guyanese society. It is a gangrene which is eroding economic development. It is unsettling social stability and paralyzing the police force's capability to control crime. Gang violence is now entrenched on the coastline and in the hinterland, because many mines are subject to attacks by gangs. Some of the gangs, of course, are Venezuelan sindicato gangs. But some people, some enterprising gangsters, leave the coastline and go to the hinterland in the hope of robbing a mine or a forestry grant and striking it rich. Now, all the gangs are not the same, of course. We have some large gangs, and these are the big boys who are involved in narco trafficking. When you see an airplane bringing drugs from a foreign country, these are not street gangs. These are big boys. They're involved in people trafficking. Bringing young women from different countries for the purpose of trafficking. They're involved in weapon smuggling. So when you see all of these weapons on the street, they are brought into the country by big importers. And sometimes they commit contract murders. Can you imagine an execution taking place 100 meters from the residence of the presidents of this country in Main Street? Well, these are the products, these are the actions of large gangs. Then you have what I call medium-sized gangs. These commit, armed robberies, this banditry. They do carjackings, and of course, in some areas, the riverine areas, the coastal areas, we saw some large gangs which are involved in piracy, and of course, murder. In fact, quite recently, some of the big pirates, were sentenced to death. For a massacre which they executed a couple of years ago. Then you have some of the small gangs, and these are sometimes small groups of young people. Sometimes they just have one revolver. They rent one revolver, so they may be just 2 or 3 boys, and sometimes they have girls with them. But they only have one revolver among them, and they do street crime. They do like internet cafes, and they do restaurants, and gas stations. But what has happened also is that there's another category, a fourth category of youth gangs, because these are becoming a problem in the schools. Some of them, call themselves names like Gaza and Gully, after the Jamaican dancehall culture. But I don't think we should ignore them, because young children grow bigger, and they sometimes get into trouble in the schools, and they call for the big boys to come in and help them. So the gang culture is becoming part of Guyanese society, but we should be careful not to normalize gang culture. It is an aberration, and it has to be stamped out. Um, Whether they're large, medium, small, or youth gangs, um, we need to trace the origin of these gangs back to the troubles in the early 2000s, because that is where I think it started. At least that's what the PPP said. That is where drug gang warfare started, and that's where the phantom gangs became a phenomenon in Guyanese political scene. Uh, where do these gangs operate, and uh, what makes them so powerful? What makes them so enduring from year to year? And we have to pay attention to the struggle of the public service. For example, you see the Guyana Revenue Authority every now and then, having to seize huge amounts of contraband. Now, contraband is not just a matter of soft drinks and cigarettes. Sometimes people bring in guns. And when we talk, jokingly about backtracking, people bring guns and drugs, not just, sardines and saltfish. They deal with other forms of contraband. And the GRA is at the front line of the public service in trying to stem the tide of contraband. And then there's the question of illegal fuel. And another state agency, the Guyana Energy Agency, is concerned with contraband fuel. And again, the people who bring in contraband fuel, are not, gangs from different parts of the coast. These are, big importers. And then you have money launderers. I think the newspapers quite recently have focused on a family enterprise which was laundering, billions of dollars. So you can see, when we talk about crimes, when we talk about gangs, we're talking about some big players. And some years ago, I don't think there's been a recent report. Some years ago, one gang had actually constructed an airstrip which at that time was longer than the Eugene Corai airstrip at Ogle, 1,100 meters. Now, you've got to have a lot of equipment, and you've got to be able to do that, without being interdicted by the law enforcement agencies. And after 5 or 10 years, the police have to know who built that strip. But what was found in the strip was a large airplane which was capable of bringing over a ton of cocaine at one time. And it was only discovered because when the plane landed, I think the wheel came off, and eventually the GDF was able to find it. But that is one of the big mysteries of narco trafficking in Guyana. This gives you an idea of the capability of narco traffickers. And it gives you an idea of the size of the group. One person cannot do that. That's not family business. Somebody has got to make arrangements in a foreign country for an airplane to bring in the drugs. Somebody's got to build the airstrip. Somebody's got to receive the drugs, distribute and market those drugs. So you're talking about a very complex organization. Next thing you know, you pick up the paper, drugs from Guyana turn up in Antwerp. Drugs from Guyana turn up in Hamburg. Drugs from Guyana turn up in Rotterdam. No, what is happening? Guyana is becoming a sort of entrepot for international trafficking. And you've got to understand that the gangs we're talking about are not a few street gangs with bicycles. These are people who have international connections. They have the capacity to bring aircraft and land in different parts of Guyana, away from Teddy Jagan and Eugene Correa. They have the geographical scope and they have the logistical capability to involve themselves and other people in a major industry that is narco trafficking in the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Let us look at the question of causation. Why did these gangs come into existence in the first place? They come into existence to commit crime. That's how they make their living. That is their business. And to protect their criminal enterprise, they acquire guns. They bring in guns. And people who get in the way will be killed. So they need enforcement because their trade is profitable. It is lucrative. And when we look back at the criminal enterprises earlier in this century, in 2000, you're talking about gangs which are very profitable, which are capable of committing murder. They equip themselves with guns, and they're not hunting deer. They're killing people getting away. That is the problem with the gangs. They're murderous. And what we have now is a subculture in Guyana based on guns and drugs. And both of them are imported. That is the danger with transnational crime. It is not a joke. It's not backtracking. Guns and drugs come from abroad. And people have turned Guyanese society upside down because of this gun and drug culture. So what we see is that with the presence of gang violence or the emergence of gang violence in the early 2000s under the PPPC administration, we see not only drug trafficking, but we've started to see execution murders. And not only did the PPPC administration speak about drug gang warfare, but also the commission, high-ranking police officer said that, this is the gun culture, the drug culture was responsible for the deaths. And he specifically mentioned that after one certain notorious narco trafficker was extradited, well, not through Guyanese efforts, because he mistakenly went to Suriname, and Suriname chief of police at that time was a man called Santoki. And Santoki, I think, got hold of him and he was out. But what we know from our Guyanese police officers is that execution murders decreased by about 75% once that trafficker was removed from this jurisdiction. So we see that cocaine is not a victimless crime. We see that it caused murders in Guyana. Perhaps no other time in the history of Guyana have we seen a situation which really nearly 1,500 people got killed, and also over 20 policemen got killed. And there's some monuments all over the country, commemorating the events of the Troubles. And monuments in Bartica, monuments in Ivleri, monuments in Buxton, monuments in Lusignan. And we must not let the Troubles return to Guyana. And what has been happening is that cocaine trafficking has been at the root of the drug culture, particularly, coming across the borders, because we don't produce coca in this country. And it is smuggled, and weapons come with the cocaine or with the traffickers. And also, we have guns from Brazil, and Brazil is one of the largest manufacturers of small arms in the world. So we have a major exporter of narcotics in Venezuela and a major exporter of guns. And we have long borders, 1,300 kilometer border in Brazil and 800 kilometer border in Venezuela. So unless we deploy our policemen to the borders, and so instead of Mandela Avenue, clean up Mandela, let the municipal council clean up Mandela Avenue. Get the policemen and the soldiers on the borders, because that is where the drugs and the guns are coming from. And what has happened also, these gangs we're speaking about today, these these drug gangs, which are spewing violence in the country, they've now established some, well, not now, for some time, they've established what I call the inter-Guyana's connection. You know, you hear about the inter-Guyana games, well, we have inter-Guyana connection because people move apparently with some ease illegally from Guyana to Suriname, Suriname to Guyana, or Cayenne, as it's called. And from time to time, people in French Guyana, Cayenne, protest about the number of Guyanese in their jails. So we have an inter-Guyana phenomenon created by gang violence, in which Guyanese, if they're under some form of indictment in Guyana, will move to Suriname and then move to French Guyana. So we are created, or we are part of an international network, um, not not only for normal trade, but also for illicit trade, contraband. And I think Guyanese have become victims of this crime of gang violence because the violence affects very many communities, and some people are quite innocent. And there are many communities in the coastline and also the hinterland which have been victims to some extent of gangs. And what we need now to look at is how this gang violence is affecting us. As you can see, we've been getting a lot of seizures of drugs, seizures of illegal weapons, and I think the police statistics may change from year to year, but at least every week about 2 illegal weapons have been seized. And also, again, they have not been reported recently, but there have been rogue policemen. Sometimes, policemen are moonlighting and serving as guards for drug traffickers. And it is not infrequent that police officers, having left the service, go and work for drug traffickers. And it is no secret. And the collaboration of rogue policemen is a contributory factor. And as you know, back in the Troubles, we also had a case in which electronic surveillance equipment, which is only supplied to governments, turned up in the hands of a notorious narco trafficker. So all of these factors, the collaboration of people in official public service and also political people contributed to the phantom gangs, contributed to the gang warfare that tore this country apart during the Troubles. And that is very dangerous. The contract murders, execution murders, the murder for hire, whatever you choose to call it. This is what is apparently insoluble by the police force at present. And the gangs, we don't know the names of the gangs. Sometimes a name would pop up in the newspaper. There's something called the Cayenne gang. I suppose that has links with French Guyana. Then there's something called the Money Over Bitches, the MOB. I don't know if it's just an acronym developed, MOB, Money Over Bitches. They have been responsible for violent crimes in this country. And in September 2019, in February 2020, and from time to time you read of a house being burnt or a car being burnt, and you want to know how this happened. You've heard about the Hot Skull Gang, people wearing tattoos with a skull and crossbone and that type of thing. You've heard about the Spoiled Child Gang, but nobody knows for sure how many gangs there are in existence and the damage these gangs are doing, robbing victims, burning cars and houses. How can we reduce gang violence? That is the problem. We know that the gang violence that we're experiencing, even up to today, started during the PPP era under the presidency of Dr. Jagdeo. Some people attribute it to the jail breakup, but it started before that. It started well before that. And by 2002, the PPP rushed to the National Assembly with a raft of laws. On paper, the laws were quite harsh, quite draconian. And, you had the Criminal Law Offenses Amendment Act, the Firearm Amendment Act, Prevention of Crime Amendment Act, Summary Jurisdiction Amendment. They amended a lot of the laws to make them more harsh. But harshness is not, a way to ensure effectiveness. Many of the laws that they tried to amend were criticized by Amnesty International and by civil society, even in Guyana. And some of them are really just paper on the law books, because it is difficult for the police force to enforce them, because the police force was deliberately weakened. And for a long time, the PPP administration itself failed to carry out the reforms in the police force. So many of these laws, were never fully enforced. And although laws are necessary, they're not sufficient. Laws don't enforce themselves. You need to have law enforcement agencies, particularly the police force, which is unbribable. And I think that is where the problem exists, that you have a large body of unenforceable laws, and there are many convictions under these laws. What we need to see is that, what you need to understand is that unless gang violence is snuffed out, suppressed, eliminated, eradicated, you're going to continue to have other forms of violence, because the children who were 4 years old in 2003 are now, 24 years old in 2003. And they grew up seeing dead bodies. They grew up with bullet holes in the walls of their houses. They grew up, hearing gunfire at night. They grew up seeing, the police racing through their villages. And now that they're grown up, now that they're adults, some of them, for different reasons, and we'll come to that in half a minute, have themselves become involved in gun violence, because, the sound of shooting was the language of settling disputes, during the Troubles. And we need to look as a country, as a community, how are we going to deal with that? Certainly, as president, we had to tackle although it was not as intense as during the Troubles, we had to tackle the problem of violence. And we went to great extent. We brought experts from Britain. We introduced something called the Security Sector Reform Action Plan. You remember that? And certainly people would remember that, there were no big gang executions at that time. We established the National Anti-Narcotics Agency because we knew that drug trafficking was at the heart of the problem. And as soon as the PPP got into office, they abolished the National Anti-Narcotics Agency. Well, what's going on here? What's going on? Why abolish an agency that is established to suppress the drug trade? And also, we had implemented the National Drug Strategy Master Plan. In all fairness, the National Drug Strategy Master Plan had its origins when President Hoyt was in government since the early 1990s. And it gradually evolved into a national plan. But you ask anybody about the National Drug Strategy Master Plan, you ask anybody about the Security Sector Reform Action Plan, and they don't know, because the present administration has just abandoned those plans. So we are now in a planless state. And not surprisingly, gang warfare has returned and it is causing death in some communities. My friends, let us think about the future. We're not going back to the past, to the days of the troubles. Let us think about where we go from here. Let us think about our children. Let us think about our communities. Let us think about the type of Guyana we want to see in 2030, years from now. Uh, what has happened is this gang violence that is affecting our communities or families is fostered to some extent, to a large extent, by the large number of unemployed youth, by poverty, by school dropouts, and of course by the transnational nature of narco trafficking and gun running, because we do not protect our borders. We have our policemen and soldiers in the wrong place at the wrong time. If we admit that the violence, is rooted in drugs and guns, which we do not produce in Guyana, what else, why do we not deploy our security forces where they are needed most to protect our citizens and protect our countries? Um, and of course, some of those communities which are suffering from gang violence, they have very low investment in social services and they have a lot of other problems pointing to neglect by the central government, the central administration. So let us look at a sort of way forward. Let us look at a formula, an agenda, um, a plan of action for the communities. First of all, First of all, and this may seem unconnected with violence, with gang violence, we need to improve the public education system. We need to improve the attendance of young people into primary and secondary schools. We need real universal primary and secondary education. Not a top school here or a brilliant student there, but we need to get thousands of Guyanese who are not in school into the school system. Education must be the foundation of this transformation. And when the AP and UAFC coalition introduced the buses, people laughed. But you can't get children to school without boats and buses and bicycles. And the pandemic has, inhibited, prevented many children from going to school. We now have to get back to paying attention to getting children into school. That is the first. That is where it begins. We need an educated population. We don't need dropouts. We don't need what the journalists call NEETs, people, children who are not in education, employment, or training, any ET. We need children who are educated. And well, the hope is that educated children are less likely to be drawn into or seduced by these gangs. Secondly, we need real employment, um, opportunities and real training. That is why the APN UFC coalition re-established the Guyana Youth Corps so that young people who had dropped out for any reason, children from the hinterland, Amerindian children, Indian children, African children, mixed children, could go into the Guyana Youth Corps and learn a skill over a long period of time, say about a year, so they could become employed. There's no point giving a man a job for $40,000, to clean up a street or a gutter. Yeah. That is worse than a band-aid. We need to get people trained back into the Guyana Youth Corps so they can get real jobs. Thirdly, my friends, we need to reintroduce real social cohesion. You know, this is not going to happen by accident. We know there's an ethnic problem in Guyana. We know there's a class problem in Guyana. We know there are problems of inequality in Guyana. And we need to have an organization which drives social cohesion. It is not going to happen. It's not going to happen when people just bulldoze their way into communities. It will happen by implementing some of the measures that we use in the coalition to improve social cohesion in communities and to reduce inequality, not only between ethnic groups, but also between coastland and hinterland, and between rural and town. And we also need to reform the public security system by promoting real community policing. On another occasion, we'll discuss community policing. It is not a question of giving people blue T-shirts and a baton and a pair of handcuffs. That is not community policing. Community policing involves the police commander sitting down with the community, finding out what are the vulnerabilities, and helping to solve the problem with community leaders. Not just barging into communities, with batons and handcuffs, but sitting down with the community leaders, helping to solve problems. And that is why we need to look at local government. Don't forget, my friends, that less than a year after the APNU AFC got into government in 2015, by March 2016, we were able to hold local government elections. Before we left office, we had two local government elections. And the present administration being in office for 30 months, and they haven't been able to get the act together. Why is local government necessary? Because that is the essence of Article 13 of our Constitution, inclusionary democracy. People, even of different ethnicities, different interests, will be able to sit down in every neighborhood, and there are 6 dozen neighborhoods in this country. And of course, the indigenous communities have their own form of local government. But we'll be able to sit down together and solve the problem through regular and continuous consultation. My friends, we must not feel that gang violence is normal. We must try to eradicate gang violence. It is not inevitable that we must live under the shadow of a gun. We must not feel that this is an inevitable calamity. We can, by working together, implementing these measures, eradicate gang violence. We call for enlightened political policies, enlightened social measures, and enlightened economic planning, which serves the people of this country in order to eradicate forever the scourge of gang violence again. Thank you, and may God bless you all.